What we're looking at here is a Sumerian tablet that actually shows the Tree of Life.
Around 6,000 years ago, in the hot, muddy marshlands of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers bleed into the Persian Gulf, something happened that has never been fully explained. A people appeared, and in the space of just a few centuries, they did something no humans had ever done before. They invented writing. They built the world's first true cities. They gave us the wheel, advanced mathematics, astronomy, organized law, monumental architecture, and the first great work of literature. In a stretch of swamp where not long before there had been only scattered villages, civilization itself seemed to switch on almost overnight. We call these people the Sumerians. And here's the strange, stubborn fact at the center of everything we know about them. The single, most basic question you can ask about any people, where did they come from, has never been answered. Their language is related to no other language on Earth. Their origins are still argued over by the world's leading experts more than a century after we first dug them up. And now, as modern science finally turns to DNA to settle the question once and for all, the answers turn out to be far stranger and far more slippery than anyone expected. Because the Sumerians themselves left us an answer to where they came from. They wrote it down in the oldest words humanity ever recorded. We just spent 6,000 years refusing to take it seriously. To understand why the origin of the Sumerians is such a profound mystery, you first have to understand music, just how extraordinary they were. These were not primitive people slowly fumbling their way toward civilization. The Sumerians arrived in the archaeological record at full sprint. They built Warwick, by some measures the first real city on Earth. A walled metropolis that may have held tens of thousands of people at a time when most of humanity still lived in tiny farming hamlets. They invented cuneiform, the first writing system, pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets. And with it, for the first time, human thought could be stored, transmitted, and preserved across generations. And the list keeps going. They developed a sophisticated number system based on 60, which is why to this very day we have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. We are still right now using a system handed to us by the Sumerians. They charted the movements of the planets and stars with startling accuracy. They engineered vast irrigation networks to tame the floodwaters. They wrote down laws. They composed the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest great story we possess, thousands of years before Homer. In short, an enormous share of what we mean by the word civilization traces back to this one people, in this one place, in a stunningly short window of time. And to be fair and honest, they did not appear from absolutely nothing. Earlier cultures like the Ubaid had lived in the region before them and laid some groundwork. But the leap in sophistication that came with the Sumerians is real, and it is dramatic. Something changed. Something accelerated. And the people at the center of that explosion are in the most literal sense a people whose origin we cannot pin down. They built temples that reach for the sky. The ziggurats, vast step pyramids of mud brick rising above the flat plain, the towering ancestors of the biblical Tower of Babel. Their city of Eridu was remembered in their own traditions as the first city in the world, the place where civilization began. They organized society into a complexity we still recognize today. Bureaucracies, scribes, schools where students learn to write, specialized craftsmen, priesthoods, kings, courts, and trade routes stretching for hundreds of miles. They had contracts, receipts, and accountants. They had myths and prayers and love poems. They built essentially from scratch the entire apparatus of an advanced society. And they did it first before anyone else on Earth had shown the way. The first and deepest clue that something doesn't add up is hiding in plain sight in the very words they spoke. The Sumerian language is what linguists call a language isolate. That means it is related to no other known language on Earth. None. Not a single one. Think about how unusual that is. Almost every language humans speak belongs to a family, a branching tree of related tongues descended from a common ancestor. English, German, Hindi, Persian, Russian, and Latin are all cousins in the vast Indo-European family. Arabic, Hebrew, and ancient Akkadian belong to the Semitic family. Languages have parents. They have siblings and cousins. You can trace them back through time and map how they are connected. Sumerian has none of that. It sits utterly alone. No parent language, no sibling languages, no descendants. It is a complete linguistic orphan connected to nothing else that has ever been spoken anywhere on the planet, as far as we can tell. So ask yourself the obvious question. If a people's language is related to no other language on Earth, then where exactly did that language and the people who spoke it come from? Every other group leaves a linguistic trail you can follow home. The Sumerians leave a trail that simply stops music at the edge of the marsh and goes nowhere. Linguistically, they are from nowhere we can name. It is not for lack of trying. Over the past century and a half, scholars have desperately attempted to connect Sumerian to almost every language family imaginable, to the Dravidian languages of southern India, to the languages of the Kaukasus Mountains, to Turk tongues, to ancient languages of the Near East, even to language families on the other side of the world. Every single attempt has failed to win acceptance. Sumerian stubbornly refuses to be related to anything, and there is an even stranger wrinkle buried in the language, one that hints at a mystery within the mystery. When linguists study Sumerian closely, they find that some of its most basic words, including names for certain occupations and places, do not actually seem to be Sumerian at all. They appear to be borrowed from some other, even older language, the tongue of a people who were apparently in Mesopotamia before the Sumerians and who have left no other trace. Scholars sometimes call this ghostly unknown tongue the substrate language. So the picture deepens. The Sumerians, whose own origin we cannot trace, may have inherited fragments of their language from a still earlier people whose origin we cannot even begin to guess at. It is music, mystery stacked on mysteries, all the way down into the dark. And that linguistic mystery is matched by an even older, more frustrating argument among the experts, one so persistent that scholars have given it a name. They call music the Sumerian problem. For more than 100 years, Assyrian archaeologists have been locked in debate over a single question. Were the Sumerians native to southern Mesopotamia, music, or did they migrate there from somewhere else? And if they migrated from where? The theories have flown in every direction. Music. Some scholars argue the Sumerians came down from the mountains to the east in what is now Iran. Music. Others propose they sailed in from the Persian Gulf, a seafaring people arriving from the south. Some look toward the Indies music valley far to the east. Still others insisted they were homegrown, the direct music descendants of the earlier farming cultures of the region. The evidence has always been maddeningly contradictory. A hint pointing one way, a clue pointing another. Nothing conclusive. Music. After a century of digging, translating, and arguing, the honest summary is this. Music, nobody knows for certain. The people who invented the very idea of recorded history are themselves a people without a confirmed origin. We can read their tax records and their poetry, but we cannot, music, say with confidence where they came from before they arrived to write any of it down. And tantalizingly, the Sumerians' own myths point to a homeland that sounds less like a place on a map and more like a memory of paradise. They wrote of Dilmun, a pure, bright land where there was no sickness, no death, no predator, and no prey. A kind of Eden somewhere out across the waters of the Gulf, associated with the very origins of life and the gods. Was Dilmun a real place they music, remembered coming from, a trading partner mythologized over centuries, or a pure invention of the religious imagination? No one can say, but it adds one more layer to the puzzle. When the Sumerians looked back toward their beginnings, they did not point to the marsh around them. They pointed outward across the sea toward a perfect land that may never have existed at all. So in recent years, science turned to the one tool that seemed like it might finally cut through the argument: music DNA. And this is where the story takes a turn that almost no one expects, because the dream was simple. Dig up Sumerian remains, sequence their ancient DNA, compare to populations across the world, music, and trace their genetic origin like a thread back to its source. It has music, worked spectacularly for other ancient peoples. We have mapped the migrations of Bronze Age Europeans, the spread of farmers across continents, music, the mingling of ancient populations, all written in the code of old bones. But the Sumerians fought back in a way. The same lush, hot, waterlogged marshland that gave birth to their civilization is one of the worst environments on Earth for preserving DNA. Heat and moisture are the enemies of ancient genetic material. They break it down, scramble it, erase it. The land that made the Sumerians also, in a sense, devoured their genetic record. Usable ancient Sumerian DNA is extraordinarily scarce. We simply do not have the rich library of ancient genomes for them that we have for so many other peoples. So scientists turn to the next best thing, the living. In the marshes of southern Iraq today live a people called the Marsh Arabs who have inhabited those wetlands for a very long time and who have long been considered the most likely living descendants of the ancient Sumerians. Researchers surveyed their DNA. The Y chromosome passed down the male line and mitochondrial DNA passed down the female line, searching for the genetic ghosts of Sumer. And what they found in the bodies of these people was a predominantly local Middle Eastern ancestry. The genetic signal pointed inward toward the region itself, suggesting that if the Marsh Arabs descend from the Sumerians, then the Sumerians too were most likely an indigenous people of Mesopotamia, not migrants who had swept in from South Asia or some distant land. By their genes, the people of Sumer look like people of the Near East, local, homegrown. So that settles it, right? The DNA says they were from here. Not so fast. Music, because there are two enormous problems with calling the case closed, and they go to the very heart of what DNA can and cannot tell us. The first is the sheer thinness of the evidence. We are leaning on the genetics of a modern population and a tiny handful of fragile ancient samples to speak for a civilization that lasted thousands of years and absorbed countless peoples. Scholars themselves caution that there were individuals from many different regions living among the Sumerians. A single genetic snapshot cannot capture the truth of who they all were. The data is a keyhole, not a window. There are tantalizing possibilities still waiting to be opened. Bones excavated nearly a century ago from the Royal Cemetery at the great city by the famous archaeologists who first unearthed Sumer's treasures were rediscovered in recent years, sitting forgotten in unopened boxes in a museum. They may yet yield ancient DNA that could sharpen the picture. And there's the deeper question of the Ubaid people, the culture that lived in southern Mesopotamia before music. The Sumerians and helped lay the foundations they built upon. Were the Sumerians simply the Ubaid people evolved, or were they newcomers who moved in and transformed everything? Even this, the relationship between the Sumerians and the very people who came right before them remains unresolved. The genetic story of who exactly was standing in those marshes when civilization ignited is still being assembled fragment by fragment. But the second problem is the deeper one, and it's the one that should genuinely make you stop and think, because DNA can only answer one specific question. It can tell you whose children you are. It can trace the biological line of parents and grandparents and ancestors stretching back through the body. What DNA cannot tell you is where your knowledge came from. It cannot tell you the origin of your language. It cannot tell you the source of your gods, your mathematics, your writing, your laws, your entire civilization. A people can be biologically local, born of the soil they stand on, while their ideas, their identity, and their most sacred knowledge came from somewhere else entirely. And on that question, the question that actually matters, the question of where the Sumerians' astonishing knowledge came from, the DNA is completely silent. It cannot help us. It was never able to. So if the bones won't tell us and the genes can't tell us, there's only one source left to ask, the Sumerians themselves. And this is where the story stops being a dry academic puzzle and becomes something that raises a hair on the back of your neck. Because the Sumerians did not stay silent about where they came from. They were, after all, the people who invented writing. And among the very first things they chose to record on clay tablets in the oldest words humanity ever set down was the story of their own origin. It is not the story you would expect. Consider the Sumerian king list, an ancient document recording the rulers of Sumer stretching back into the deep past. It does not begin with an ordinary king founding an ordinary dynasty. It begins with a single staggering line. That kingship, the very institution of rule and order and civilization, descended from heaven. It came down from above and was placed in their cities. And the king list gets stranger from there. The earliest rulers it names the kings said have reigned before a great flood are credited with reigns of impossible length. Not decades, not even centuries. The list records individual kings ruling for tens of thousands of years each. one for nearly 30,000, another for 36,000. Then comes a dividing line in the text, a catastrophe. The flood swept over the land. And after flood, the rains suddenly shrink toward human scale. Scholars debate endlessly what these numbers mean, whether they're symbolic, mathematical, or mythologized memory. But the structure of the document is unmistakable. The Sumerians believed that before the flood, the world was ruled by beings of a wholly different order, with lifespans beyond anything human, in an age when the boundary between the divine and the earthly was thin enough that kingship itself could be lowered straight out of the sky. Consider their gods, music, the Anunnaki, the great powers of the Sumerian cosmos, the deities who in their telling shaped the world and the fate of humankind. The name itself is debated music, and honesty demands we note it. Scholars generally translate Anunnaki along the lines of princely offspring, or those of royal blood, the high gods of the pantheon. In the popular imagination, the name is often rendered more dramatically as those who came down from the heavens to earth. And you should know that the scholarly and the sensational versions are not the same thing. But strip away the argument over the exact words, and the role these beings play in the text is consistent and remarkable. They are powers from above who descend, who involve themselves directly in the creation and ordering of human life, who hand down rule and knowledge, whatever you call them. The Sumerians place the origin of their world and their wisdom in the hands of beings who came from somewhere higher and other than the earthly plane. And consider, most striking of all, the figures of Sumerians and their successors called the Apkallu, the seven sages. According to these ancient traditions, the Apkallu were semi-divine beings who brought the gifts of civilization to humanity. Music. They didn't claim humans figured it all out alone. They claimed it was delivered to them. The most vivid version of this was recorded later by a Babylonian priest named Beresis, describing a tradition inherited from the Sumerians. He told of a being named Ons, a creature part fish that emerged from the waters of the Persian Gulf. By day, Ons came up onto the land and taught the people everything: writing, mathematics, the building of cities, agriculture, the laws, the arts, the entire toolkit of civilization. And at night, this being returned music, beneath the surface of sea into the water, only to rise again the next day to continue the lessons. Sit with what that means. The Sumerians did not claim to have invented civilization through their own genius. Over and over in their oldest records, music, they insisted that their knowledge was given to them, handed down by beings who descended from the heavens and who rose music up out of the sea. Their own explanation for the source of everything that made them extraordinary was music, in the plainest possible terms, that it did not originate with them. It came from elsewhere. It came from beings who were by their own description not from here. Music. And this wasn't a fleeting half-remembered tale. The image music of the fish sage was carved into stone and repeated for thousands of years across Mesopotamian civilization. In the palaces of the later Assyrians, you can still see them, imposing figures draped in what appears to be the skin of a great fish. The fish's head rising over their own like a hood, standing guard as protective, knowledge-bearing spirits. These were the Apkallu, remembered and revered long after the Sumerians themselves had faded, the bringers of wisdom, depicted as creatures of both the human and the watery world, forever associated with the moment civilization was delivered to mankind. An entire chain of cultures across thousands of years, music, preserved the same memory that the knowledge came from beings who were not entirely human, music, and who came from the water and the sky. That is the testimony of the people themselves. Music, the first testimony ever written down by anyone anywhere. Now in the modern era, some have taken these texts and run with them as far as they will go. The boldest interpretation popularized by the writer Zechariah Sitchin in music, embraced by the ancient astronaut movement, argues that the Anunnaki were not gods or symbols at all music, but literal extraterrestrials. Visitors from beyond the earth who came to Mesopotamia gave humanity civilization, and even in the most extreme versions genetically engineered our species. And here, honesty matters because it's what separates a real mystery from a fairy tale. Mainstream scholars in Assyria overwhelmingly reject this interpretation. Sitchin's translations of the ancient texts are not accepted by the experts who actually read Cunia. They say he bent and mistranslated the words to fit his theory. There is no DNA evidence, No physical artifact, no scientific proof whatsoever that the Sumerians were aliens or were engineered by them. And as we've seen, the limited genetic evidence we do have points to a local human Near Eastern population. So, let's be absolutely clear. We are not telling you the Sumerians were aliens. We are not telling you spaceships landed in the marshes of Iraq. But here is why this idea refuses to die, and why it isn't quite as foolish as it's often dismissed. The ancient music, astronaut theory grips people not purely out of fantasy, but because the underlying facts are so genuinely strange. The Sumerians did appear with a startling, almost vertical leap into advanced music civilization. They did speak a language related to nothing else on Earth. Their origins genuinely cannot be pinned down after a century of expert study. And they themselves in their oldest and most sacred writings insisted again and again that their knowledge came from beings who descended from the sky and emerged from the sea. You do not have to believe in flying saucers to feel the weight of that. You only have to take the Sumerians seriously when they tell you in their own words that the source of their civilization was not from here. So, let's bring it all together, because the truth that emerges is more unsettling than any single tidy answer. Where did the Sumerians come from? Here is what is actually true. Their bodies, as far as our scarce and fragile DNA can tell us, appear to have been local flesh and blood of the ancient Near East, children of the land between the rivers. That much the genetics leans toward. But their language belongs to no family anywhere on the face of the planet. Their origin as a distinct people remains a genuine unsolved mystery after more than 100 years of scholarship. Their explosion into full civilization was so sudden and so complete that it still astonishes the researchers who study it. And they themselves, using the very gift of writing they claimed had been handed to them, recorded as their official history that everything they knew came from beings who were not human and not from this place. The honest answer to the question, music, where do the Sumerians come from, is not outer space, but it is also emphatically not that we know. After 6,000 years, after all the digging and translating and sequencing, the truthful answer remains. We do not fully know. The people who taught the human race how to write things down used that very invention first and foremost to insist that they were not the original source, that the knowledge had been given to them from somewhere beyond. For 6,000 years, we have read those words and assumed the Sumerians were simply being poetic, that the gods descending from heaven, the sages rising from the sea, the kingship lowered from the sky, that was all just metaphor, the imaginative myth-making of an ancient people dressing up their own achievements. But what if it wasn't metaphor? What if the very first people to ever write anything down were doing exactly what writing is for, recording the plain truth as they understood it? What if when they told us their civilization came from elsewhere, from beings not of this world, they weren't writing poetry at all? What if they were simply telling us where they came from, and we were the ones who weren't listening? Maybe the honest position is to hold both truths at once, that the people of Sumer were in their flesh sons and daughters of the Near Eastern Earth, and that their language, their genius, and their gods came from a source we still cannot identify, and they themselves placed beyond the human world. Science can trace one of those threads. It has never been able to touch the other, and the gap between them is exactly the size and shape of the mystery that has haunted this story for 6,000 years. The DNA can trace the blood. It cannot trace the knowledge. And the knowledge, the writing, the mathematics, the cities, the gods is the part the Sumerians always said came from somewhere else. Their bodies may have been born of the marsh, but everything that made them the Sumerians by their own ancient and unwavering testimony was not from here. That's where the next expedition begins. If you want to come with us into the deepest mysteries of who we are and where we truly